Welcome to the Age of Reason, the Enlightenment, and 18th century literature. I'll start with my overview on 18th century Europe. And as you can see, I've started with an image by the illustrator and poet William Blake of Newton from 1795. So perhaps you can comment in your response this week as to why you think I began this presentation with that image. So, while some nations lost political power in the 18th century, Great Britain rose to great heights. For France, it was the Age of Enlightenment, an intellectual and philosophical boom that culminated with the beginning of the French Revolution in 1789. As European explorers roamed the earth, they discovered hitherto unknown countries and ways of life. Of course, the trade and conquest that made European powers immensely rich also brought the scourge of racism and colonial exploitation. In the 18th century, Britain's expansion into an empire was fueled by the slave trade, a source of profit that belied the national self-image as a haven of liberty. At the end of the 18th century, as many writers joined the abolitionist campaign, they forged a new humanitarian ideal that attempted to contend with the suffering that came alongside progress. As is true throughout these chaotic periods of history, when great change is more commonplace than peace, the arts and literature flourished. The period between 1660 and 1785 was a time of amazing expansion for England, or for Great Britain, as the nation came to be called, after an Act of Union in 1707 joined Scotland to England and Wales. Britain became a world power, an empire on which the sun never set. A sense of new, expanding possibilities, as well as modern problems, transformed the daily life of the British people and offered them fresh ways of thinking. Literature had to adapt to circumstances for which there was no precedent. One lasting change was a shift in population from the country to the town. The life of the city, where every daily newspaper brought new sources of interest, had moved far away from traditional values. Formerly, the tastes of the court dominated the arts, and the monarch stood for the nation. But the 18th century witnessed a turn from palaces to pleasure gardens that were open to anyone for the price of admission. The people of London set new standards of taste, and art joined with commerce to satisfy those desires. For example, the artist William Hogarth made his living not through portraits of royal and noble patrons, but by selling his prints depicting the middle class's everyday foibles to a large and appreciative public. London itself, its beauty and its horror, its ever-changing moods, became a favorite subject of writers of this age. Two significant features of the age were the large part played by England in the Continental Wars and the rapid expansion of the British Empire. The Continental Wars were fought to prevent any one nation from gaining overwhelming superiority by force of arms, and to save the small buffer states from becoming absorbed by their powerful neighbors. The expansion of the empire received a tremendous impetus in this age when India, Australia, and the greater part of North America were added to the British dominions. The influence of this movement appears in the books of an age, which takes us into the drawing room chatter of politics or fashion or criticism, and into a world of adventure and achievement. I think, therefore I am, said French mathematician and philosopher René Descartes. These words symbolize what the Enlightenment meant to European artists and philosophers in the 18th century. It was no longer acceptable to hold truth simply. First, it must be scrutinized and taken apart. A group of European thinkers known as the philosophes built on Descartes' work by combining strands of hard science, mathematics, sociology, and even literature in their quest to study the human race as a body that can always be perfected. Enlightenment philosophers like John Locke professed the importance of the social contract. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau believed that people were fallible and that they must be more tolerant of all religions, while at the same time recognized that religion was something that cannot fit into the spheres of human nature or the natural world. The literature of the day spelled out these concepts. In 1784, Immanuel Kant published a brief essay called What is Enlightenment? That exemplifies German Enlightenment. Quote, Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed non-age. Non-age is the inability to use one's understanding without another's guidance. This non-age is self-imposed if its cause lies not in the lack of understanding, but in indecision and lack of courage to use one's mind without another's guidance. Dare to know. Have the courage to use your own understanding is therefore the motto of the Enlightenment. For Kant, enlightenment signified self-knowledge, which implied an understanding of both human nature and the uses of that knowledge. The 18th century witnessed an outpouring of human knowledge in almost every field of human endeavor. In enlightenment, knowledge would conquer fear, superstition, enthusiasm, prejudice, and death itself. But even Kant did not let this optimism go to his head. He asked, Are we now living in an enlightened age? His answer was an emphatic no, but he was careful to add, we live in an age of enlightenment. So even as the period drew to a close, soon to be swept up by the French Revolution and then romantic anti-enlightenment ideals, even Kant knew that criticism of the whole social and political system of the West was necessary. The ancient regime, characterized by a semi-feudal economy, a division of the population into orders and estates, religious intolerance, fanaticism and superstition, royal absolutism, and government corruption, all needed reform. The common goal of Enlightenment thinkers was social reform. They saw themselves as the social engineers of a new Europe. Western Europe was advancing away from an agrarian economy while trade and commerce were growing. With wealth, Enlightenment thinkers turned from a Europe of want, depravity, and need to a Europe characterized by abundance. With abundance, new possibilities were about to become reality, and more time was devoted to the pleasures of life. Of course, this practice had all been set in motion by the Renaissance. As a result, a new optimism pervaded the age. Instead of viewing human history as the story of the steady decline from the Garden of Eden, life was full of promise and hope. In characteristic 18th century language, the quote, dawn of the New Jerusalem seemed to be just around the corner. However, this would be a Jerusalem of this world, not postponed until some life after death. This new optimism produced the notion that man was indeed a progressive being, and that perfectibility was possible. The exploration of lands outside Europe brought new information, revealed new and diverse ways of life, stimulated curiosity, and developed comparative approaches towards customs and traditions and institutions. The result was a new worldview. Just as philosophers pondered the actuality of the state of human nature, and artists explored real-life subjects, scientists who lived during and after the years of Copernicus, Galileo, and Sir Isaac Newton strove to make sense out of the facts of science. In the wake of the new knowledge imparted by Newton, the branch of science now known as physics progressed in leaps and bounds. The scientific revolution continued throughout the 18th century with the full support of the enlightened people of the Age of Reason. Philosophers speculated on the character of the universe, nature, God, man, morals, happiness, knowledge, and 100 other things. As science revealed more of the extent and workings of the physical universe, the God of Judeo-Christian tradition became less compatible with the emergent picture of the cosmos and the laws of nature. Inductive science slowly overcame deductive logic. Nature came to be regarded as complex and impressive, while simple biblical explanations were no longer satisfactory. God was portrayed as a law-giving and law-abiding being, yet natural causes were sought to explain the workings of the natural world. Man still possessed an immortal soul, but the natural philosophers were no longer willing to let man pass merely as the image of God. Among advanced thinkers, morality was gradually divorced from the supernatural conception of sin. It was instead related to behavior on this earth and its effects upon the individual and society. Change was in the air in the 18th century, not rebirth, but birth itself. A future of improvement, intellectual and human happiness, equality, and liberty was near at hand. Such optimism could perhaps have only become manifest among a society whose spokesmen claimed to be enlightened. Irony abounds, however. If God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. And the Age of Enlightenment and the French Revolution created a kind of radicalism still enveloped by Christian idiom. In November 1790, in response to the radical dissenting preacher Richard Price's keynote address in praise of the glorious revolution of 1688, the statesman Edmund Burke published what would quickly become the Manifesto of Conservative Political Opinion, the Reflections on the Revolution in France. Opinion was now polarized. On the one hand, liberalism, on the other hand, conservatism. The result of the battle of words developed over the next few years and supplied us with a new vocabulary. Liberal, conservative, socialist, anarchist, liberty, equality, fraternity, capitalist, and capitalism are all products of the age of the French Revolution. Of course, these were mostly the ideas of men. However, women during the 18th century were expected to work on their moral character and their more ornamental accomplishments. As growing emphasis was placed on new ideas and reason amongst men, many felt it was important to keep the place of women stable as nurturers of the family and caretakers of the home, so as to maintain consistency in the basic threads of society. Nevertheless, female philosophes such as Mary Wollstonecraft analyzed the condition of women in modern society. Wollstonecraft's work retains much of its original radicalism. Her reflections on the status of the female sex were part an attempt to come to a comprehensive understanding of human relations within a patriarchal civilization. Her first publication was on the education of daughters. She went on to write about politics, history, and various aspects of philosophy in a number of different genres that included critical reviews, translations, pamphlets, and even novels. Best known for A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, her influence went beyond the substantial contribution to feminism she is most remembered for and extended to shaping the art of travel writing as a literary genre. She had an impact on the Romantic movement, and she also happens to be the mother of Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein in 1818. Even before newspapers appeared, the press had become a mighty power in England, and any writer with a talent for argument or satire was almost certainly hired by party leaders. Addison, Steele, Defoe, Swift, most of the great writers of the age were on occasion the willing servants of the Whigs or Tories. So the new politician replaced the old nobleman as a patron of letters. Another feature of the age was the rapid development of social life, and this is also reflected in the literature. In the first half of the 18th century, some 3,000 public coffee houses and a large number of private clubs appeared in London alone. The sociability expressed by these venues was typical of all English cities. The influence of this social life on literature was inevitable. Nearly all these writers frequented the coffee houses, and matters discussed there became subjects of literature. There is an enormous amount of 18th century writing devoted to transient affairs, politics, fashion, and gossip. Moreover, as the club leaders set the fashion and manners and dress, in the correct way of taking snuff or of wearing wigs or ruffles, so the literary leaders emphasized formality or correctness of style, and often satire. To write prose like Addison or verse like Pope became the ambition of aspiring young writers. The most significant literary development of the 18th century was the novel form, by which I mean a fictional prose narrative of significant length. Many of the first novels were epistolary, a novel written in the form of letters exchanged by characters in the story. Samuel Richardson's Clarissa is a prime example. This is the tragicomic story of a young and virginal heroine whose quest for virtue is continually thwarted by both her family and, of course, a rakish suitor. This form was especially popular in the 1700s. The other popular novel genre was the sentimental novel, or novel of sensibility. This form, this form reflects the sentimentalism of the 18th century as reflected in the comedies and domestic tragedies so popular in the theaters. Richardson's Pamela, which follows the twists and turns of the marriage plot, was the beginning of this vogue. Fielding's more realistic Tom Jones was written in protest. The rise of the novel coincided with the rise of the middle classes in Western Europe. Advances in technology and printing made written texts, including periodicals, miscellanies, epistolary fiction, pamphlets, journals, and diaries, etc., more available to a growing population with the education and leisure time to read. Changes in modes of distribution and in literacy rates brought books to populations excluded from education through such places as penny lending libraries, so working class men and women of all classes were able to read, novels mostly. Instead of relying on patronage, authors became free agents in the literary marketplace. They depended on popular sales and literary reviews for success and sustenance. Novels reflected the values of a middle-class readership. In particular, female readership was drawn from romances to novels. The novel, then, provided a moral and religious self-education according to societal expectations of gender, while also representing a kind of feminine social mobility. The 18th century emphasis on sensibility was a reaction against the Stoicism of the 17th century and the theories advanced by political philosopher Thomas Hobbes that human beings were primarily motivated by self-interest. 18th century moral philosopher David Hume proposed that we should instead guide our behavior through our senses. He held that ethics are based on feelings rather than abstract moral principles. In general, sensibility is a term describing a reliance on feelings as guides to truth and not on reason and law. Sentimentalism has two meanings. First, overindulgence in emotion, especially for the pleasure that this feeling provides, and second, optimistic overemphasis on the goodness of humanity, or sensibility, representing in part a reaction against religious thought which regarded human nature as depraved. Sentimentalism will give way to Romanticism in the latter part of the 18th century. It's really difficult to summarize the literature of this age, or to group such antagonistic writers as Swift and Addison, Pope and Burns, Defoe and Johnson, Heywood and Fielding. It was also the age when women writers began to write novels, and writers such as Aphra Behn, Eliza Haywood, and Fanny Burney were some of the first women to earn their living by their pens. It is simply for convenience, then, that we study 18th century writings in two main divisions. The reign of so-called neoclassicism and philosophy, and the beginnings of the modern novel. Sorry about that. That's the last slide. As a whole, although with some exceptions, the 18th century is an age of prose rather than of poetry, and in this respect it differs from all preceding ages of English literature. The 18th century is an age which embodies both exuberance and paradoxical solitude. The public is increasingly concerned with conversation and social exchange, while at the same time individuals are engaged in the private encounter with a novel, as a literary montage of letters, diaries, memoirs, news, government documents, and even philosophy. Thank you very much.